This is LING 270, Language, Technology, and Society, Module 5, Writing, Literacy, and Society. In this lesson, we'll talk about writing system reforms which have occurred in regions outside of China as well. What we'll talk about in this lesson are examples of other major writing system reforms and see what we can learn from these writing system reforms. In particular, we'll look at an example of how a European language is reformed. We'll review, really, the development of the Hangul writing system for Korean. We'll talk about the writing system reform implemented in Turkey after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and the development of the Vietnamese writing system based off of the Latin writing system. We'll talk about how these reforms affected literacy, if at all, and we'll talk about what other reforms might actually lead to reform a writing system. What other motivations are there besides just the interest in increasing literacy? We'll discuss that as well. So very often we see attempts to increase literacy by developing a simplified writing system. We've looked at this idea a lot in the People's Republic of China and their attempt to simplify the Chinese writing system. So usually we'll see a development of a writing system with a set of fewer rules, symbols, or exceptions. We might also see the system adapt itself to represent the native language and the modern language, as opposed to some other language which is used for reading and writing. And these kinds of reforms are frequently attempted, not just in China, but across the world. However, we can see that in each of these cases, we can't really conclude that it is these reforms which led to increases in literacy. And we'll talk about later in this module how the key factors for increasing literacy are actually economic. So we'll start talking about how writing systems were reformed for European languages. European languages, in contrast to many regions of the world, have long histories of literacy. They have very often developed a written standard of the language, which was standardized hundreds of years ago. But nonetheless, and although the language may have changed significantly since then, the same written standard is used today. This is a fact that can explain a lot of irregularities in the English writing system. A lot of these spellings were had a more clear pronunciation in English as it was spoken in the late Middle Ages. And English pronunciation has changed a lot since then. Very often European writing systems are very irregular, and because of this, they are often targets of efforts of reform, partially to increase literacy. These reform proposals usually try to regularize the spelling in some way. The reform that the textbook looks at, and I'll talk about a little bit later, is the Paardenboomregel, developed to standardize Dutch spelling. Now, it's important to note that when we have a tradition like in these European languages where a standard language is used for a very long time, developing a new standard can end up making two competing spellings, which can kind of can cause confusion and difficulty for people to adapt to. So this is a difficulty that is frequently run into. And oftentimes, the reforms that actually end up getting implemented are very subtle and very minor, and they aren't usually the fundamental reforms that we would expect to affect literacy in any way. So one writing system more closer to home for many of us is the simplifications developed for American English. We can see things such as the OU in color being replaced with a single O in American English as a way of making it somewhat more simpler. But really the differences between American English and British English, at least in their written standards, are incredibly minor. And really, they aren't that different as writing systems. And we see this, that the reforms of European languages are very, very minor reforms. So let's kind of take a look more closely at this Paardenbloemregel, which is a system of writing reform developed for Dutch. So in the Dutch language, Dutch, like German and to a certain extent English, can form compound words out of two nouns. And usually this is accomplished by taking the two words and linking them with a linking morpheme, which is either spelled with an E or EN. So for example, in the word paardebloem, meaning dandelion, we see the word paard and bloem, meaning horse flower. So now the interesting thing to note here is that although this linking morpheme has two different spellings, it's actually pronounced the same in the modern language. They're both pronounced as a schwa. So this is an example of how the spoken Dutch language has diverged from the written language. In 1954, the spelling rule was initially that if the first noun is a singular, use an E, otherwise use an EN. So for example, if we're using the word for horsepower, we're talking about the power of one horse. So we use just the E ending. But if we're talking about a horse lover, someone who loves horses, we use EN because a horse lover presumably loves horses in general, not just one particular horse. So that's how these two endings were initially used. But this kind of rule is actually kind of complicated to use in practice. It's hard to think about should this first noun be singular or plural. So because of that, there was a proposed reform to this rule in 1995, which said that if the first noun formed plural with an EN, then use EN. In all other cases, use E. So this was a way that could attempted to make this kind of spelling more simplified and more standardized. But this kind of created a problem, which is that there were a lot of words that had already been used very frequently, like paardebloem, which would now have to be respelled under this new rule. The Dutch people didn't want to have to rewrite all of their botanical textbooks and things like that just to get in line with this new rule. So because of that, the designers of the Paardenbloemregel created a large set of exceptions, saying, for example, like words like paardebloem, that would be affected by this change. It would only be other words that were affected. But what we see here is, although the Dutch attempted to simplify the usage of this rule, all we ended up doing was making the rule more complicated because they had to add so many exceptions. So since the Dutch language was so entrenched, it was so difficult to actually implement this spelling reform. And ultimately, this is the reason that the spelling reform was done away with in 2005. And in these intervening years, we see that there really hasn't been any fundamental change in the literacy of Europe. So this is an illustration of how difficult it is to actually reform a writing system, especially in a country like the Netherlands, which has been literate for many hundreds of years. Sometimes just making a reform causes more exceptions, causes more difficulties than benefits. Now, a writing reform which was kind of more successful would be the development of the Hangul writing system, which we talked about pretty extensively in the writing systems unit. To review, the Hangul is a writing system developed specifically for the Korean language. It was developed by King Sejong, who wanted to make a writing system that was tailored to the Korean language, and it was intended to increase literacy in Korea. Now, recall that prior to this point, reading and writing in China was done in Korea was done in the Chinese language. So in order to be able to read and write, you would actually have to speak Chinese. And King Sejong wanted to develop a writing system which would avoid this kind of situation. So the intention was that this would be a system that would allow the literacy to increase. Now, it did take a long time for Hangul to actually replace the method of Chinese writing, but in the modern day, Hangul is the predominant writing system used in Korea today. But even in its very early proposals, Hangul's adoption was very strongly resisted, especially by academics who kind of preferred the older Chinese writing system. We also see that during the period of history where Korea was occupied by Japan, the usage of the Korean writing system was actually forbidden. So going back to talking about the academics resisting the reform, a main reason that they resisted it is because they saw this as an attempt for Korea to distance itself from China, and they didn't want to distance themselves from China. They saw China as a center of culture and education and tradition, and reforming the writing system was perceived as an attack on that kind of system. So a writing system can become very associated with these associated with the ideas of education, and so simplifying a writing system can kind of be seen as, in a way, dumbing down the language. And a lot of times we see resistance to that as well. And we also see in the case of Japanese occupation that the Korean writing system was associated with Korean nationalism, and that was not something that the Japanese wanted to permit. So really, there's a lot of cultural significance that goes in with a writing system, and a lot of times it's these cultural factors that really influence how a writing system is used or reformed, rather than aspects of literacy. So that's an interesting thing to keep in mind. So another major writing system that we can discuss as well is the writing reform that occurred in Turkey. So in during the time of the Ottoman Empire, Turkish was primarily written using the Arabic abjad. So you can see an example of a text written in Ottoman Turkish in the top left here. So recall from our writing systems unit that an abjad is a writing system which uses primarily consonants, as opposed to an alphabet which uses consonants and vowels. Now, this is a writing system that suits the Arabic language pretty well because Arabic has a very small number of spoken vowels. But this isn't really the case for Turkish. So the Arabic writing system wasn't really a good fit for Turkish. To kind of illustrate this, we can see how a word written in Ottoman Turkish, which I have here written using the Arabic abjad, could represent 5 different Turkish words. So we can this KWRK, that could represent the word gevrek, kürk, kürek, körük, or görek. So we can see that there are all different combinations of vowels and consonants, but all of which are represented using the same kind of characters. And this is just a result of the fact that the Arabic writing system really wasn't developed to represent the Turkish language very well. So all of these different words can become confused with each other. During the time of, after the fall of the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Republic replaced it. Here on the right, you can see a picture of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, who the first president of the Turkish Republic, and you can see him demonstrating this new Turkish alphabet that had been developed to replace Ottoman Turkish. So as we can see in this alphabet, that it is primarily like the Latin alphabet, but with a few small modifications for letters that exist in Turkish. So we can see some new letters with diacritics on them. And like we see in China, we see that since from the 1920s to the present day, we see that there has also been a massive increase in literacy. But again, we should remember that correlation does not imply causation. So it's important to note that during this time period, there has been a significant amount of economic development in Turkey as well. And perhaps it's the economic development that's really a better explanation for the increase in literacy in Turkey. And well, another factor to consider for the Turkish writing system reform is that the reforms implemented by Ataturk in the Turkish Republic were involved in transforming the Turkish society from a previously Islamic society to a more secular society oriented towards Europe. So it's kind of interesting to see that a component of this involved the adoption of a Latin alphabet. So here we can see that the writing system reform is also pretty closely related to a cultural reform. So we can see yet again an example of a cultural shift that can also explain how a writing system was reformed. Now here's an example of a writing system where a romanization actually ended up becoming the written standard. So this is the Vietnamese Quoc Ngữ system. Back during our writing systems unit, we talked about the Q Nom writing system, which was a system of representing native Vietnamese words using Chinese characters. But this system ultimately became replaced by a system using Latin letters. And this was made the official writing system of Vietnam in 1910 by the rulers of Vietnam at the time, namely the French colonial administration. The writing system they developed here was very similar to Pinyin in that it was developed out of a system that had been developed by European missionaries. But Quoc Ngữ actually ended up becoming the primary written standard and eventually replaced the Chinese characters that had been used previously. Like these other writing system reforms, we also see that from 1945, when Vietnam achieved got its independence from France, to 1998, we see a major increase in Vietnamese literacy from 10% to 95%. But again, we see this coinciding with a major increase in economic development. So we really can conclude that these writing system reforms were the key to this literacy increase. But yeah. So to conclude what we talked about in this lesson, we can see that in each of these instances, a lot of these writing system reforms occurred with cultural reasons attached to them. So we can see how the Turkish writing system reform coincided with a shift from the Ottoman Empire's culture to a secular Republican culture. Literacy is not always the main interest in this case. However, it is often a major interest. And we've also seen how in many cases when a new writing system or a new spelling reform is developed, it can cause more confusion than it actually benefits. And that kind of confusion certainly wouldn't be conducive to increased literacy. And we've seen that in the examples of writing systems that we've looked at, such as Turkish, Vietnamese, and Chinese, we see a correlated increase in literacy with the writing system reform. But really, in each of these situations, the economies of these countries also improved as well. And it's perhaps these economic factors which are more important for literacy than the writing system itself. So in the next lesson, we'll actually examine how economic factors are related to literacy.